right, so guys, hi. Thank you all for being here. My name is Netta Bondy. I'm a front-end developer. I've got over 10 years of experience. This is the point where I'm supposed to give you all of my titles so that you know that I'm somebody worth listening to. But I just recently made a baby, so that's my main title right now. Principal Baby Manager. That is me. And today I want to talk to you about a really cool new web API, relatively new, called View Transitions. I'm a little bit nervous because I want to address the elephant in the room, and I'm not sure it's a good idea, but I'm going to do it anyway. I just want to say it's been a shitty year. Shouldn't have said shitty maybe, but it's been a rough year. And I just want to acknowledge that because I know that it's very difficult to a lot of people, maybe some of the people sitting in this room. And it might feel a little bit weird to be in a developer conference talking about animations while so many hard things are happening in the background. So I don't know, I just want to acknowledge that that exists and that two things can be true at the same time. Like life can be hard and we can also come together and talk about things that we care about for our work or that are just interesting to us. Personally, I'm going to geek out a little bit during this presentation because I get really excited about things like this. But I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, that's it about that. Welcome to the talk. Let's talk about View Transitions API. I have to say, I was surprised when I saw that this talk was going to be in Hall A because it's been my experience that developers don't like animations. And they don't like talking about animations. They don't necessarily like listening to people talk about animations. You give a developer an animation task, even like a front-end developer, even an experienced front-end developer, and they're going to be like, no, I don't want to do that. Because animations are hard. And I think animations are hard mainly in sort of two different ways. One is that animations are a skill set. Writing keyframe, writing animation functions and timing functions, it's a skill set that most of us have not had the chance to hone, and so it's always difficult when you run into it, when you don't do it on a regular basis. But I think the sort of bigger issue or bigger trouble or bigger problem that we have is that UI state is hard. Oop, my clicker stopped working. Okay. UI state is hard. When we are dealing with UI state, right, so we talk a lot about app level state, especially in React apps, like that's a huge issue. But when we talk about UI state, the state of my screen, the state of my UI, that is an incredibly difficult problem that I want to argue we do not have a good solution for yet. What do I mean by that? So let's imagine an app, the kind of app we all love to write, a dashboard. And imagine that you have a dashboard with a bunch of widgets or a bunch of moving pieces on it, and you also have a sidebar. And your sidebar can be either open or closed, and based on whether it's open or closed, the rest of the widgets and the rest of the content on your screen is organized differently. They're bigger, they're smaller, some things maybe disappeared, some things are positioned differently. And imagine that this is your app, and the UI designer comes in and says, we have to animate that. We have to animate that transition. Ooh, I want to animate that. I want to animate the widgets moving on the screen. You're going to walk out of the office and maybe the workplace and decide that you're not doing that. And that's what I mean when I say that UI state is hard. I have this dashboard, right? Everything gets organized differently. How am I going to represent that as state? It's going to be, is sidebar open? True, false, right? And from is sidebar open, true, false, I have to figure out everything else that is happening on my screen, and now I have to animate that too. And this is what I mean when I say we don't have a good solution. Is sidebar open? That's not the state of my screen. That's not my UI state, right? I have to manage all of the transitions that have to do with that UI state. So the good news is that the View Transitions API does have access to UI state. So this elusive thing that we need to sort of capture with a Boolean or whatever data structure we're using, the Web API has access to the actual thing, to the actual UI state. And I want to tell you what that means, and I will tell you what that means. But before I do that, I want to show you how we use this API, and then I'm going to progressively show you the capabilities and what the type of solutions we can get when we have access to something capturing UI state. So, a demo app, if you will. This is a photo viewer. It's a very simple photo viewer. There's a footer down here with images. If I click the image, the photo changes at the top, and so on and so forth. We're going to look at the code for this photo viewer. It is HTML and JavaScript, so there's no React. And I want to go over the code really quickly. So first, let's just try and kind of conceptualize what it does. Then we'll look at the code quickly, and then we want to bring in the View Transitions API. So you can imagine that every single small thumbnail image here in my footer has an SRC property, as they do. And then you could imagine that in my JavaScript, when I click that image, I'm able to access it as the target of my event. I'm able to pull the SRC property off of it. I can create a new image. I can set the SRC on the new image, and I can attach that to the main section that I have going on up there. Okay? This is my app. It's very basic JavaScript code. We'll look at that quickly. So this is my HTML. You see there's a main section up there, and then there's a footer with a bunch of images. Each image has a class of thumbnail. It has an SRC property. It has an alt property, and then it has a title, which I will use to generate the caption. And if we look at the JavaScript, it looks beautiful. You can see that I'm pulling in the thumbnails here. And to each of them, I'm attaching a click handler, which runs this function called showcase. Okay? Showcase is a function that will create a new image element using, again, the SRC from the target of the event. And it will create a caption using the title property from the target of the event. And then it just attaches this new image and the caption to the main container. This is no View transitions yet, right? Just vanilla, JavaScript, HTML, CSS. I'm going to bring in the View Transitions API. I want to show you what it does, and then we'll start working with it. So let me pull up this code right here and comment it out. This is like the best conditions to be coding in. I really recommend it. Code in front of an audience. You'll never be scared of anything again. Okay. Let me comment this one out. So you can see here that I'm, again, attaching a click listener to my thumbnails, except now it's going to run this function called showcase with VT. That's showcase with View Transitions. And all I'm doing is I'm taking the API here. So the API, to use it, I make a call to document.startViewTransition. And I'm passing in my showcase function as a callback to that. Okay? This is it. I'm hooked into the API. I did nothing else with my CSS. I've changed nothing else. This is all I've done. I want to show you what it does to my app. I'm going to reload this. It'll take a second. And I'm going to click an image. And it's subtle, but if you look, it's there. There's this subtle fade-out, fade-in effect. My images, the transition between them is not so rough anymore. There's like a very subtle effect there that makes my app look a lot smoother. So just to recap, right, hooking into the API, I make a call to document.startViewTransition, and I pass it a callback. And now this is important. This callback needs to encapsulate all of the changes I want to make to the DOM as a part of that transition. So if we have that huge dashboard that we talked about before, and there's a bunch of things changing, all of them need to be encapsulated in that function. My function for this simple app, it encapsulates the creation of the new image and the creation of the caption. But if I were to use this in production for a bigger screen, I would need to put all of the changes that I'm making to the DOM into this function. And here is why, because this is how the API works. So before my callback is called, my function, the API will take a snapshot of the DOM, of the existing DOM. Then it'll run my function and create a live representation of the new DOM. So you can imagine at the point where my function has finished running, where the callback has finished running, the API now has access to a snapshot of the old DOM and a live representation of the new DOM. And this is what I mean when I say this API has access to actual UI state. It has access to the actual state of our screen. And you can conceive that if I have that sort of old DOM and I have that new DOM, then now I have a way to manage the transition between them. I can manage that as I would any other transition. And in fact, what the API does is it just sets the opacity of the old DOM to 0. It sets the opacity of the new DOM to 1. And we get this very subtle fade-in, fade-out effect that we just saw. So this is very cool. Like, it works kind of well for my photo viewer app. It makes it look a little bit smoother, but it is, at the moment, very limited, right? Because I seem to have no control over what is happening over the transition. So the second part of using this API is using the language we love most, CSS. And in fact, the API provides us with a tree of pseudo-selectors in CSS that we can now customize, and we can customize the transition for under this sort of tree of view transitions. So the top level element, the view transition pseudo element, is an overlay that sits on top of the page. It includes all of the view transitions that are happening in the page. The sections that are important for us right now to see how we can use that and animate that in CSS is the view transition old, so that's the old DOM, quote unquote, or the snapshot, and then the view transition new, which is the new DOM. Notice that these two are at the root level. But this is available to me in CSS. In fact, the whole opacity switch thing that we saw before, the API is just using CSS. It's using the CSS opacity property to make that switch, right? But if I were to want to customize the way that transitions works, I could just go in and apply some CSS to these elements. So let's have a look at that. Here's my CSS. Let me pull up this section. All I'm going to do right now, I'm not going to get too much into this transition, into this animation, but I want to show you that I can customize it. For example, I can set the duration on it, right? So I'm going to change the duration of this transition to be 5 seconds. I'm going to reload my app again, and what we're going to expect here is to see this whole opacity switch that we talked about happening just really slowly. So now if I click an image, you can see it fades in very gradually over 5 seconds, and then I can click another image, and we can see how one is fading out and one is fading in. So you see that I'm controlling both the transition out of the old view transition and the transition in of the new view transition. And there's also something else interesting that is happening here. So I'm going to click a third image, and then I'm going to navigate over to this purple image right here. You can see where I'm clicking. I'm actually clicking this. Oh, good. I'm glad it shows up on the big screen, because you can see that I'm clicking this very vigorously, and nothing is happening until just now. And in fact, I want to show you that if I were to actually check when my click handler is running, let me just console log here and refresh. And I want to show you that, in fact, the function that I expect to run, the click handler that I expect to run, is not running when expected. So I'm clicking an image. Here's my click log, and now I'm clicking this other image next to it. Nothing is happening, 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 and there it goes. Okay? So in fact, what you saw here, or what you might guess that you saw here, is this delay of 5 seconds that I have imposed on my transition. So what's happening? In order for the API to do its job well, right, to transition from an old DOM to a new DOM and be consistent about what's happening, it has to pause all other rendering for the duration of the transition, right? We don't want to change from an old DOM to a new DOM and have something change in the meanwhile. We're never going to be sure about where we end up. So for the duration of the transition, the API pauses all rendering, and my app, in fact, becomes unresponsive, which means, yes, you do not want to set your animation duration for 5 seconds when you're using this API, okay? Generally, you don't want to set your animation duration for 5 seconds. That's a really long time for a user to be waiting, but definitely here, you don't want to make your screen unresponsive for that such a long time. And also, what's more important is that even though I titled this talk, Animate All the Things, you actually don't want to animate all the things with the View Transition API because the View Transition API has a side effect of pausing all rendering on screen while the transition is happening. Okay? So when do we use this? Well, we don't use it to animate a button. We don't want to use it to animate a toggle. We want to use this API in places where, again, UI state matters, where it's difficult to switch from one state of the screen to another state of the screen. So screen level transitions, large elements that have a lot of moving bits that need to be animated in different ways at the same time. These are good candidates for using the View Transition API. Don't use it for a button, or definitely don't use it for all your buttons, because you're going to be pausing your rendering anytime an animation runs. Okay. So we talked about how we hook into the API. We talked about how we can customize the main transition with CSS. And now you might say, and you would be right in saying so, well, I never animate like an image and a caption. When we work in production level apps, we usually have a lot more things happening. We don't usually animate very few changes at the same time, and often we don't want to animate them all in the same way. So again, if I look at this demo app, if I want to have my image enter in some sort of grand manner and like, ta-da, pop up on screen, I probably don't want the caption to be doing the same thing, right? Right now, I only have access to the whole transition. What if I want to access a specific element? Well, there's also a solution for that. So this is the View Transition pseudo elements that we have seen. Okay, this is what's available to us out of the box. But we can also very easily poke holes in this tree in order to target the transition of specific elements. And we do that using the CSS property called View Transition Name. So this is quite similar to animations. We will select the image that we want to create a special transition for and assign a View Transition name to it. This can be any name that I choose. And what the API will do is it will grant me access now to an old and new version of that specific element under that specific View Transition name. So to show you that in context, this is my CSS. Here is my image, my main image. I'm going to assign it a View Transition name called image bounds. Let me remove this section here. I don't want it to take that long anymore. Let me pull up this code. So I've created an animation, a bounce-in animation that I want to apply to my image. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the View Transitions API again with this View Transition name, image bounce, and then I can just set the animation on that in the same way that I would with just regular CSS. And now you can see, or what we expect to see, is we expect to see that animation being applied to the image, but I want the caption to not get that sort of bounce-in effect, okay? So when I click my image now, let's close this one, you can see that they're, wow, just appearing like magic with this bounce-in animation. But if you, oh, thank you! I copied that function off of like some guy's blog post, but it is really pretty. But the more important thing is that if you look at the caption, you see that my caption is not bouncing in, right? So my caption has like the default fade in, fade out effect that makes it a little bit smoother, but it doesn't get that other animation that sits under the View Transition name. Okay, cool. So we have talked about how you hook into the API with document start view transition. We have talked about how you manage root level transitions with a view transition pseudo element, and then how you can target specific elements with view transition name. And at this point, if you guys are excited about animations in the same way that I am, or if you are excited about this new API, you should have a pressing concern that's sitting in the back of your head right now, which is, right, good, thank you. One person is listening. You guys, what about React, right? My demo app was HTML and JavaScript. Nobody in this room, do you write HTML and JavaScript for your production apps? Raise your hand. Yeah, yes? No? Okay, everybody here writes React, right? Because we are in ReactNext. This is the reason why we're all here. So what about React? What's the problem with React? In React, we don't, or we shouldn't, have any access to the DOM. We can't do all of these things that I talked about writing a function that changes the DOM and then wrapping it in the API. We shouldn't be able to do that because we don't change the DOM. React changes the DOM. That is our contract with React, is that React will do it efficiently, and we will never, ever, ever do it because it messes everything up. So what does that mean? Can we use this API in React? Well, if we understand how the API works, and if we understand how React works, we could possibly conceive of a way that we can connect the two of them. Because while I don't change the DOM, React does eventually change the DOM, right? I don't have access to that as a developer, but something along the way, in the way React code works, it changes the DOM. So if I can figure out where that change is happening, and if I can encapsulate that, I could conceivably wrap it in the call to the API, and then I could conceivably use the API in React, and it is, in fact, possible. So here's a very simple React app. There is a div here. The important thing about this div is that both its width and its height are derived from a variable called box size, and box size is a state variable. If I have a call to set state in React, conceivably, this is where my DOM is eventually going to change. Not by me, but it's going to change nonetheless. So the width and height of this div is set with this state variable called box size, and I also have a resize function so that when I click it, it gets resized. So if I understand, or I imagine that my call to set state is the thing that is triggering a DOM change, then I could. This doesn't have autocomplete, and it's a very weird experience. I could conceivably wrap that in the call to the View Transitions API, and I should be able to see the same effect. Right? Can you see? It fades in, it fades out. This tells me that the API has taken place. So we've seen how we hook into the API. We've seen how we can customize it with CSS, and we can even punch holes in it in order to customize the transition of specific elements. And we now also know that we can quite easily hook into it with React. And honestly, if we go back to the example of the dashboard, if you have ever run into a situation where you need to manage such a huge transition, this is a game changer. The amount of work that we would have needed to do to manage a transition of UI at the screen level is just huge, and it would break so easily. Like, can you imagine having to make all of these changes to all of these little widgets? The access that we have here to an API that is able to capture UI state is really, I want to say, game-changing to the way that we can manage these huge animations. And I hope I've been able to convince you of that. But even more so, I have a secret agenda that I was hoping to convince you of, which is that oftentimes, certainly in animations, we need to prefer the native solutions that are available to us in the web. We have a tendency, we hate animations, right? We've been through that. Nobody wants to see a talk about animation. I wouldn't want to see a talk about animations. And what we tend to do is we tend to reach for a library. I hate it. I don't know how to do it. It's hard work. I'm going to grab a third-party library, and they're going to do that for me. Well, guess what? The third-party library doesn't have access to UI state either. They're doing the same things that you would have done that would have broken. And if there's a native solution, the native solutions do have access to UI state. Not only this API, if you even think about something like pseudo-selectors, the disabled pseudo-selector has access to actual UI state. It has access to the disabled property on a button in the actual DOM. And so when we're in the places where we have, and we have a lot of good solutions today for animations native in the browser, and in the places where these solutions exist, I want to encourage you to prefer native as an alternative that might have a bit of a learning curve. It's not just taking somebody's API and using it, but in the long run, it'll be more sustainable, it'll be more robust, and it's able to do things that we as developers, we just don't have access to. That was all for me. Thank you very much. It faded out. Okay, listen, you guys. That's my Twitter handle. That's fine. You can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm there a lot. This is more important. If this is interesting to you, the View Transitions API, the Chrome developers platform has a great article about it where they show a bunch of use cases. It's amazing what they've been able to build with it. I encourage you to look into that. Thank you.